Canada has made dozens of contributions to the world, like the alkaline battery, which is used all over the place, insulin, which has saved the lives of countless diabetics, and the pacemaker, which has lengthened the lives of the elderly and those with heart problems by years, if not decades. But it's sad that almost nobody has bothered to learn about the history of Canada. I aim to set that right. Please sit down, ladies and gentlemen, and listen as I tell you about the Great White North, the country which has been vital to the progression of our world, Canada.
Good afternoon. My name is Darrell Willier. That's Darrell. Willier, Willier. I'm a Cree person, First Nations of Canada. I have a university education. I graduated from Trinity Western University in 1990 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology. Part of my work in the school system is to help students as well as the school system to better understand and to gain knowledge on First Nations, Métis, Inuit education and culture.
When do you think the Aboriginal people came to Canada, or Canada, which Canada originally derived from, or were they born here?
I would say we have been here for 20,000 years at least, if not more. We don't really have paper records because in our culture, the First Nations culture, our records were all oral history. So we don't have things in writing.
How do you think the Aboriginals reacted when the Europeans first came to what is now Canada?
We were very intrigued by the light-skinned people that came across the ocean and coming in these big boats because we only had canoes. We didn't have the big boats that they had. We were very welcoming to the new people because we believed that this land is our land. And when I say our land, I mean ours, as in you and I. And so it's about sharing our land. Canada is our country, meaning that it's for all the people in Canada, not just the First Nations.
Yeah, that's good. Can you stop now? Then we can change the... Canada was originally the home of the Métis, First Nations, and Inuit as far back as 16,000 years ago, though most of them were known by different names as far as I know, such as the Iroquois. Then, in the 15th century, the French and the English found what was to be modern Canada. They fought, explored, and colonized all over Canada, forcing the Indians to move from where they had lived for almost 16,000 years. How have the Aboriginals reacted to the changes to Canada over the years? Like all of the discoveries made by Canada?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Since we became a country, a lot has changed for the First Nations, Métis, Inuit people of Canada. And a lot of people don't know about this one very important piece of legislation that started in April of 1876, which was 9 years after we became a country.
The Indian Act?
Exactly. It's called the Indian Act. And the rules of the Indian Act, or the laws of the Indian Act, supersede or override the Canadian Charter. So for a First Nations person such as myself, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't apply to me. The Indian Act overrides that. Because the first rule of the Indian Act says that the Canadian government and the Minister of Indian Affairs Canada is in complete control and management of all peoples, property, monies of First Nations people.
How have they reacted to the wars that Canada have become a part of? From what I know of Aboriginal people, they seem mainly peaceful.
When I think about all the wars that Canada has been in, the First Nations and Métis Inuit people of Canada played a an important role in the wars. 1812, World War I, World War II, Korean, Vietnam even, although Vietnam is more American. But we've had involvement in all those wars. And for example, a lot of people don't know this also. A lot of it is hidden history. And now, for example, the Canadian government just in October of 2018 started to advertise on TV the contributions of First Nations in the World War I and World War II. And for example, in World War II, the federal government finally decided to tell Canada that the Canadian Army had First Nations code talkers. And that was in part with, they worked with the Americans, the Allies, and the Americans had Navajos and Shoshones, and who was the other group? There's three groups that were code talkers, so they would speak in their language, and the Germans and the Japanese couldn't decipher those languages, or the code, they thought it was some code. And for Canada, we had Cree, Ojibwe, and Huron code talkers. And there again, the Japanese and the Germans couldn't decipher that, what they thought was a code. And really, in reality, it was just our language.
Do you know what contributions the Aboriginal people have done for Canada?
Yes. When you think about athletics, sports, we've actually were instrumental in a lot of sports, such as lacrosse. That's a huge part of Canada, and lacrosse has been played by our First Nations people all across Canada for centuries.
I always thought that was curling.
I'm not sure about curling. Probably not. But lacrosse was baseball, a form of baseball. We didn't call it baseball. My grandparents and great-grandparents before that, we didn't call it baseball. I can't remember what word they used to describe it, but it was very similar to what is now known as baseball. And also hockey. We had a variation of hockey, just we didn't have skates.
How has pharmaceutical companies taken inspiration from the First Nations?
They looked at a lot of our medicinal contributions and how that has helped the pharmaceutical companies get rich off of what we have been doing for centuries and continue to do. So for example, rat root. It's called a rat root, and the reason why it's called rat root is it's the root of a plant, and when it's dried it looks like a rat's tail. And that's very good. We, in First Nations lands, the Cree people, we laugh, we call it the Buckleys of Indian medicine, because it tastes terrible but works great.
That sounds like Buckley's.
Yeah, so that's really good for colds and flus and all that kind of stuff. Or another, so they use the properties from that type of herbs and plant structure to use it for medicinal, and how to make it to man-made products for cough syrups and things like that. Another really good contribution was on how to use vitamin C from small plants. So for example, rose hips, it's called a rose hip, and it's native to Alberta, and that is a super concentrated, high energy vitamin C plant.
Too bad there isn't a plant for STDs. Why is it important for Canada to know about First Nation history?
Well, I think it's really important for Canadians and even my own people to know that what the history is, what was left out. You know, for example, residential school. A lot of people don't know what that is. Even my own wife, who's Caucasian, where she grew up in Winnipeg, there was a residential school there, but all she knew was that it was a place for the Indians, and that was it. That's all she knew. She didn't know anything else about it or what it was like. Or knowing, she didn't know that, she knew there was 500 kids there, but she didn't know that most of those 500 kids would be from northern Manitoba, meaning they'd be, more than 1,000 kilometers from home. Or she didn't know, or most people don't know that residential schools, you started at you started when you were 6 years old, and you were there from September 1st till June 30th. Then you would go home for July and August. You didn't go home at Christmas or Easter. And if your parents were fortunate enough to come and visit you, they would be allowed to come and visit you 3 times a year.
Is that where the boarding school idea came from?
Yes. And if you Google this phrase, to kill the Indian in the child, 2 names will come up. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, who was the first Prime Minister of Canada, and Duncan Campbell Scott, who was also the person who helped form the idea and to implement the idea of residential school. And to also include that in the Indian Act. So then it made it a law that parents had no choice, but they had to let allow their children to be taken from their house and to be gone to residential school. Because if you tried to stop it, then you would be arrested.
Well, thank you for being with us today. Yeah, it was nice to meet you.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
I would like to thank you all for watching, and next time you think of Canada, remember, there were a lot of sacrifices made by a lot of people. Thank you. Good night.